Perfect. At this point, Peter, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Stefanos. It's so lovely to see so many friends in this very odd medium. It's nonetheless delightful to, all these little images of people who are so dear to me. And I'm very, very honored that you take your time out. So let me begin by expressing my thanks to Stefanos, Geroulanos, Charlie Coleman, Camille Robsis, and all of the others, administrative assistants and geniuses at NYU for hosting this panel. And of course, to the three colleagues who've agreed to share their thoughts. So I want to just say I recognize that these days, all of us are taxed well beyond our limit with responsibilities beyond the usual, and participating in a book forum over Zoom in the late afternoon and in midweek is not a small commitment. So for those who may not have read the book, I want to offer just a few brief words on how I came to write it and what it is that the book tries to say. Okay. So first I should say that the theoretical concerns that moved me to write this book are ones that stretch back over several years, at least as early as 2007, when I had the pleasure of joining with a few colleagues, just a quartet of us at Harvard, to read the rather imposing book by Charles Taylor, A Secular Age. Now, despite my admiration for Taylor, from whom I've learned a great deal over many years, his book, A Secular Age, troubled me. And I wrote a rather critical review of it that appeared in the Journal of the History of Ideas. What I discerned in that book was an echo of a broader theoretical view, one that punctuates the history of philosophy and social thought. Namely, the view that modernity suffers from a possibly fatal deficit of normative resources for which only religion offers a necessary remedy. This thesis of a normative deficit is a commonplace in religious thought, and one might say it's really as old as religion itself, since the religious believer will typically regard the unbeliever's world as fallen into darkness and will insist that only by hearkening to the voice of God can the world be saved. Now, variations on that theme and variations on the theme of a normative deficit of modernity belong to the deep structure of modern social theory, though of course not all modern social theorists are so apologetic about modern secular life as to appeal to religion as some kind of privileged and necessary supplement or resource. But we'll probably all recall that Max Weber gave the thesis of a normative deficit its classical formulation when he observed that the disenchantment of the world must end in a crisis of meaning, a Sinnproblem, he called it. Religiously derived norms of economic and political conduct once sustained us, he argued, and bound traditional societies into a coherent whole. But those old religious norms, he argued, were now losing their grip, though we might hope that traces of divine inspiration or charismatic authority can be revived to give modern society the direction it sorely needs, lest it ossify into a soulless machine. I wonder, can we disable the chime?
Yeah.
Do you know how to do that? It's under participants. Students of mine will know that I'm extraordinarily susceptible to background noise. Thanks, Steph.
I'll figure it out.
Okay, it's under participants, and then you have to go under more in a drop-down window there. Well, now in the century since his death, Weber's theory of secularization and the accompanying theory of a normative deficit has become a theme with many variations. The notion of a normative deficit can be found in theorists such as, of course, Carl Schmitt on the right, who condemned liberalism as a law-governed machine that tries to suppress its own need for a system transcendent grounding in the quasi-divine powers of a decisionistic leader. But it also found a more ambivalent but nonetheless somewhat receptive ear in Jürgen Habermas, who, especially in his work of the last 30 years, has increasingly come to see religion as a privileged, though perhaps not unique, source of normativity for a rationalized modernity that otherwise lacks the moral compass it requires. That is, if it hopes to resist the merely functionalist imperatives of a norm-free system. Now, despite my great admiration for Habermas, I've written in a somewhat critical spirit about that turn in his work, since I think it may reward too much to religion alone, and thereby adopts a skeptical posture about the possibility that the modern world might possess normative resources of its own, even while it might also, of course, still continue to find instruction in religious tradition. So my quarrel with him is really a small one about the modal necessity and the distinctive privilege that he rewards religion, not the question of permitting religion to serve as one resource among many. So it's a quarrel about awarding religion a unique status. And I've chatted with him about this. He doesn't think he rewards religion that unique status. He thinks that there are other resources, but he does think that there are remarkably few today, which explains some of his arguments about genetic engineering and so forth. In any case, this preoccupation with the question of a normative deficit in modernity has consumed my attention for the last several years, and it was the chief inspiration for writing Migrants and the Profane. But it's a book that also marks the definitive end to an early phase of philosophical interest in Heidegger's existential ontology and my turn toward critical theory. After wandering in the Heideggerian wilderness for more than a decade, I'll confess that it came as a kind of relief to attach myself to a tradition that speaks with such candor to the emancipatory interests of humanity and also sustains its faith in rational standards of argumentation. I was fortunate enough to exchange some thoughts with Habermas about the book when he was completing his own much more imposing manuscript, Auch eine Geschichte der Philosophie. And finally, the book is dedicated to Martin Jay, who you may notice there on the screen on Zoom, who has renamed himself, is the artist once known as Martin Jay, and is now 183165, a title which seems appropriate in our age of mechanical reproducibility. Marty was my doctoral advisor, and his work cleared the path for scholarship on critical theory in the Anglophone world. All of this is just to say that the book is one charged with personal meaning, and writing it was a true pleasure. I should note one final point before I very briefly summarize some of its arguments. I was grateful to receive an invitation from the Yale program in Judaic Studies to deliver their Franz Rosenzweig lectures in modern Jewish thought. And as a person who wrote my very first book on Franz Rosenzweig, how could I refuse that offer? This book is a revised and expanded version of those lectures, and that might help to explain why I felt it was appropriate to foreground certain questions of Jewish history and philosophy. The result, I still fear, may be two books welded together into one, and some readers may notice that the seam joining the Jewish questions and questions of social theory is imperfect. Okay, now, just to summarize the argument very briefly, the task I gave to myself in the book is to reconstruct a well-known problem in first-generation critical theory. The three main chapters of the book address Benjamin, Horkheimer, and Adorno, and my guiding claim is that all three of them devoted some attention to the question as to how religion persists in secular form. In a curious remark about Benjamin, well after Benjamin's death, Adorno wrote that theological concepts can survive in the modern world, but only if they undergo a difficult trial of secularization. They can persist, he wrote, only if they submit to what he calls a Einwanderung ins Profane, or a migration into the profane. Now, one might have thought that this secularization proviso would be a desideratum for all critical theory. But in my comparative treatment of the three authors, my conclusion is that Benjamin did not sustain a commitment to secularization with any consistency. He remained trapped, you could say, in a posture of some ambivalence, looking to theological concepts to fill what he believed to be a normative or motivational gap in historical materialism. In this sense, Benjamin endorses the theory of a normative deficit. In a rather different way, the same ambivalence about secularization is evident in Horkheimer's work. Especially toward the end of his life, Horkheimer, too, abandoned the idea of critical theory as a practice of thoroughly immanent critique, and he appealed to the transcendent powers of religion as the only possible resource for this worldly despair. Of the trio examined in the book, only Adorno, I argue, managed to avoid this posture of self-sabotaging skepticism. But he did so without endorsing a crude dualism where only secular concepts therefore have value. His negative dialectic is not religious, and I think we should insist on that point because some scholars have gone so far as to call him an essentially religious thinker. But his negative dialectic might be understood as the secularized fulfillment of a negative theology. That is to say, one that pursues the theological practice of negation without restraint until it touches upon even theology itself. In his work, then, secularization is a dynamic and genuinely dialectical gesture that moves from the theological to the secular, not endorsing the theological as such, but nor does he wish to affirm the secular as an utterly self-enclosed immanent space that cannot, even in the most minimalist way, appeal to theological concepts. Now, as a final point before I end, I want to suggest that Adorno's call for a migration into the profane holds special significance today when we're faced with a migration crisis and unprecedented challenges of cultural and religious heterogeneity. These challenges require that we reconsider dogmatic forms of secularist political organization that merely exclude religious co-citizens, even while we uphold the requirement that religious claims submit themselves to the authority of mundane reason. Without belaboring the point, the book concludes by offering some speculative comments on why the fact of modern ethno-religious pluralism requires that all of us, individually and collectively, undergo a kind of disenchantment of identity. The demand that we uproot ourselves, the insight that humanity is not fixed but wandering, is hardly new. It can be found in biblical narratives, and it appears in Augustine's City of God, where humanity appears in a peregrina in seculo, a peregrination in the profane world. Secularization is a demand that begins, I would say, in religion itself. And perhaps we can be most faithful to that original demand if we embark on the necessary, if difficult, task of a migration into the profane. And that's my little summary. I'm very eager to hear comments by my three colleagues and friends.
Seyla?
Okay. Let me begin by saying thank you for organizing this. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. This is a wonderful book. First comment, it's elegantly written and meticulously researched, holding up the standards that we have been used to expect of Peter's work over the last decade. And I think the book has a systematic concern about the problem of secularization. Secularization is a deeply ambivalent process, including both promise and loss, as Peter writes. And in the introduction, I'm quoting from him. He has a sentence where on page 11, I think, quote, "Can theological concepts serve as a source without comprising.
Compromising, I'm
Are-
afraid. Yeah, that's the typo.
Yes, and then I've put in the brackets because it's interesting, you see, the ambivalence, because can theological concepts serve as a source without comprising our distinctive modern sense of autonomy, or without compromising our modern distinctive sense of autonomy? Okay, I want to come back to this question at the end of my remarks and push more on it. Really, is it a compromise or is it comprising autonomy? Excuse me. Now, Peter tries to answer this systematic question about the status of secularization and the problem of the normative, lacking normative sources of modernity, so to speak, with reference to one of the most brilliant intellectual traditions of the 20th century, namely the German Jewish intellectuals of the Frankfurt School, whom Judith Kerr, in one of her essays actually on Hannah Arendt, called, quote, a spiritual republic whose social history was as terrible and brief as it was intellectually radiant and enduring, end of quote. And none other than Max Horkheimer himself, in his 1961 essay, The German Jews, expresses the uniqueness of this tradition when he writes, again quoting from Peter, that the Jews should through long centuries cling to a doctrine in which neither the reward of individual blessedness nor the eternal punishment of the individual played any role, that they should remain faithful to a law after the disappearance of the state that might have enforced the law, solely because of the hope in store for the just men of all nations. This is the contradiction which links the Jews with Germany's major philosophy, and indeed with all that is popularly or ironically called idealism. I think this is just an absolutely wonderful statement about this affinity and at the same time tension between the Jewish tradition and German idealism. Now, we know that Horkheimer was not always at this point. We know that in 1935, Horkheimer wrote Die Juden in Europa, which is a classical Marxist analysis of the position of the Jews in the sphere of circulation, giving rise to anti-Semitism, etc. And we know that the change in the Horkheimer-Adorno analysis of anti-Semitism and also of their attitude towards Judaism comes, of course, I think the turning point is the dialectic of enlightenment and the fragments on anti-Semitism, and increasingly their distinction between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. And anti-Judaism is then itself explained in terms of heavily psychoanalytic categories. The Jews are the others of Christianity. They are the murderers of God, of the Christian God, something that can be forgotten. At the same time, the Jews are those onto whom one projects not only the death of God, but also all sorts of feelings of envy and inferiority and this possession. This psychoanalytic trope of the Jew as the other, that is at once the victim and yet at the same time the victimizer of Christianity, is then worked with Adorno and Horkheimer, is worked by them brilliantly into their analysis of fascism. I have a question here, and I'm going to sort of punctuate my remarks with questions. What about Herbert Marcuse? I want to ask Peter why he decided to exclude Marcuse. I have my own guess about this. I'm going to say that Marcuse remained Greek and not Jewish. Maybe this is a topic for conversation that we can take up later on. Now, the book begins with a terrific analysis of Walter Benjamin's brilliant fragment on the history of the concept, the fragment on the concept of history, which, as we know, was brought by Hannah Arendt in a suitcase to the United States after Benjamin committed suicide. And I want to think for a second here about the relationship of Arendt and Benjamin around this question of history, because I want to open up a question here and return to the problem of secularism. We all know the famous story of the chess-playing automaton, that is in Turkish garb. And by the way, another parenthesis here, no one has commented on the Orientalism behind this image. I mean, is the idea that the Turk does not play chess, but this automaton does. Anyways, this is a footnote. Now, this image, which as Peter wonderfully explains, then becomes the critique, Benjamin's critique of the mechanistic understanding of historical materialism in the Orthodox Marxist tradition, has also greatly influenced, I think, Arendt in all her thinking about history. And without losing the focus on the Frankfurt School, I just want to mention an essay of Arendt's called Tradition and the Modern Age, which is the introduction to Between Past and Future. And it so happened that about a week ago, I was giving a brief introduction to this essay. And it's very clear to me that she could not have written this essay without having Benjamin in mind, although in this context, she refers to a story by Franz Kafka called Air, He, and it is just like Benjamin's angel in this short story by Kafka. He moves towards the future and is pushed towards the past, moves and is pushed, moves and is pushed. And Arendt says, well, we can think of this as a parabola. You slide down and you slide up. And she says the impulse is to just jump out of history, out of space and time, and thus break this motion back and forth. But what's interesting to me in Arendt's comment, and which gets me back to a question about the Frankfurt School tradition is this. She claims that tradition began, the Western philosophical tradition began with the tension between philosophy and politics, not religion. And this is the issue I want to get to. That for her, it begins with Plato and Aristotle's political philosophy, but in particular Plato, and the parable of the clay cave, where in fact she interprets this as the philosopher leaving the realm of human affairs, and in the cave, the prisoners are in the shadows and only see the shadows on the wall. But one of the prisoners frees himself and climbs up and sees the sun as the source of light and goodness and all the shadows. And then the movement of the philosopher is to come back after having seen the sun, the eidos, after having grasped the idea of the city in speech, to come back and to try to build it again. So it is this double movement of turning away from the political and coming back to the political. And Arendt's conclusion there is that the Western philosophical tradition, which begins with the tension between philosophy and politics, ends with Marx, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard. Marx says philosophers have only interpreted the world. The task is, however, to realize it, eliminating that tension. Nietzsche eliminates Plato's two doctrine of the world. There is not a supersensuous world behind the appearances. And Kierkegaard takes the leap into faith. And Peter has written, of course, extensively on Kierkegaard. Now, why am I riffing on Hannah Arendt when we are considering Adorno, Horkheimer, and Benjamin? Because there is really an important question here as to how we characterize the tradition. Is it the conflict between philosophy and religion? Is it philosophy and politics? Or, can those dimensions really not be separated? I am frankly a little irritated by the thesis of the normative deficit of modernity that is going to be plugged or hold or helped, or however you want to put it, by the turn to religion. I am asking the question, isn't there also political culture, civic culture, the memories of lost revolutions, what used to be called civic religion by Durkheim? And here the figure of Durkheim is interesting, Peter, also because, you and I both have written on Habermas's last book. I mean, but Durkheim is not just a sociologist of the elementary forms of religious life. He was also a great reformer and educator and believer in the idea of civic education in the French Republic. So I'm asking myself, what is happening in this revalidation of religion? What are we losing about civic culture, civic religion, education? What are all this? Why are all these sources of normativity disappearing? My final question: can we today distinguish between the power of religion versus the revival of its fundamentalist forms? I completely agree with Peter when he writes, the stranger is always everywhere, our own mirror image. Or what Kristeva had said, nous sommes étrangers à nous-mêmes, both a psychoanalytic insight and a sociological insight. But let's be honest, whenever there has been a serious religious revival, be it Christian evangelism, be it Jewish orthodoxy, be it Hindu nationalism, be it Islamic fundamentalism, it has been fundamentalist in this period. So we may wish for this decentered, polycentric, multiple universe of religion that acknowledges the otherness within us and tolerates the migrants, but I don't see it. I'm puzzled. And in that sense, I guess my own sensitivities are also here, with Adorno, who realized not the normative power of religion in terms of its danger. So I want to conclude my remarks there.
Thank you, Seyla. Max, all yours.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Very happy to be here and to be included in the discussion of this lovely book, which actually means rather a lot to me, because it is a book that explores themes, as Peter said, that a lot of us, and myself included, have been thinking about for so long. I'm going to read some remarks. They don't actually have concrete specific questions for Peter. I was a little bit nervous about that, but it's really an effort to think along with Peter, especially in the third, and to me, the most engaging section of the book on Adorno. And so in that sense, I suppose you could say that the whole set of comments I'm going to give now is just one great big question for Peter, in the sense of what do you think? So I'd like to focus in these comments squarely on what for me is the central text of critical theories exploration of theological concepts, as Peter puts it, migrating into the profane. And that's the text that I think is on the one side, on the other side, also the core part for me of Peter's book, and which is the concluding section of Negative Dialectics, the meditation on metaphysics, and in particular, the first section of that meditation on metaphysics on the idea of the possibility of metaphysics after Auschwitz, as Adorno puts it. So time won't permit much in the way of a reconstruction of the path of Adorno's thinking here, let alone Peter's pellucid analysis of it, both in Migrants in the Profane and in another recent work, Peter's essay on Adorno's concept of metaphysical experience that recently appeared in the Blackwell Companion to Adorno, a book that he and I co-edited together along with Espen Hammer. I'll need to be very compressed and elliptical in my remarks, more so than is probably useful. And I hope the text of Adorno's here, ferociously difficult though it is, will be at least familiar enough to most of you as a background for what I want to say. For Adorno, certainly idealist philosophy was and remained the sort of border post on the frontier between the sacred and profane, a processing station that receives and under some condition permits entry for the theological concepts of God or the immortal soul and the free will under transformed circumstances into their new country. In Kantian terms, the admission of these concepts into the profane world in the form of pure practical postulates of the will is always made on condition that they renounce any claim to constitute necessary conditions for empirical experience, though they're awarded a sort of special temporary immigrant status, which has to be kept on their person at all times and has to be presented on demand as necessary residents of our mind if we are to make any sense of the moral claims that we have good reason to think of as unconditionally valid for us. Adorno was certainly not the only one struck by the odd implications that this special immigrant status that philosophy issues to formerly preeminent religious concepts has for our everyday experience. Not least among these is the secular version of the religious demand for a kind of stereoscopic view of what it's like to be alive for the human life, whether in one's own person or that of any other. A kind of doubling view in which our being as animals, capable both of extreme physical suffering and destruction, entwines with our status as beings connected to something eternal and enduring, that is to say, as metaphysical beings. God is great, free will wonderful, but it's our status as ensouled animals that matters most here, because the topic on both sides, in fact, of the frontier between the sacred and the profane is death. The function of this status as an apology for bad real conditions is obvious. For Kant, at least, on what can appear as virtually fictionalist grounds, Kant in his pietism argued that the possibility of a future convergence of happiness and goodness rests utterly now on our view that human lives are souled lives, S-O-U-L-E-D, and thus extend infinitely, or at least indefinitely, beyond physical existence. Death does not have the last word, is not fully real, all the evidence to the contrary notwithstanding. In the final passages of Negative Dialectics, Adorno objects that Auschwitz marks both the historical and epistemic end of the era where this metaphysical stance is possible. The argument itself is tangled and meandering, I think, and to my mind, at least deeply ambivalent on the question of whether Auschwitz, his term for the historical event that introduced radically new forms of administered mass murder, stands for a larger set of historical developments housed under general terms, such as domination or total integration, or in some much more concrete sense doesn't stand for, but is, that is to say, enacts, rather than merely culminates, new historical conditions distinct both in degree and kind, the trends toward total integration that Adorno and his colleagues had described throughout the 1940s. But however we take this claim, whether Auschwitz marks or makes the end of an era that licensed, permitted secularized theological concepts to do secular moral work. Adorno's claim here is henceforth that philosophy will need to transfer this accreditation process to the logical counterpart of these concepts, if at all. That is to say, from traditional metaphysical ideas of immutable substance, of absolute being and all-encompassing power, to their precise dialectical negations: transience, ephemerality, insignificance, radical immanence, and utter materiality. Now, Adorno's oddly Proustian offering that he gives in Negative Dialectics as a way to reclaim this, to redeem this claim, is, in my mind, deeply peculiar. Peter analyzes this Proustian moment at the end of Negative Dialectics very well in the book that we're now discussing, and the earlier the essay on a metaphysical experience. The names of Otterbach, Waterbach, Reuenthal, and Mondrun, little villages from Adorno's own childhood, are offered up as spacio-mnemonic fragments, place names that persist in personal memory as markers, allegories for a number of concrete experiences of full contentment. Markers that are themselves transient and evanescent in a double sense, for they perdure, if at all, only through the fragmentary and often intensely vivid reactivation of a vanished collection or cathexis of memories and emotions. They are memories that in a peculiar sense stand outside of, and indeed barely impinge on, the narrative coherence of a life story, and indeed recede to the degree that they are approached. That is transience, and as transient, they disclose in their receding the evanescence of one's own life as well, one's own impermanence. This will all vanish. Nothing at all will be left behind. And in fact, this is the truth about the kind of contentment that human beings are capable of and can expect under prevailing conditions. Now, before I do a certain pivot in my presentation, let me just for the moment register the deep strangeness of Adorno's proposal here that the transformation of metaphysical experience brought about by the Holocaust should result in a renewed focus on happy memories of childhood vacations. That cannot be the end of the story. And of course, this Proustian modality of transience is, I think, one side of a deliberately bivalent and tense conception of a metaphysics of transience. In his lectures on metaphysics, Adorno claims that Auschwitz also eradicated the last traces of the bourgeois metaphysics of ensoulment, of ensouled bodies, capable in this sense of living narratively coherent lives, lives that have a beginning, a story, and an end. Even death, as the end of the physical, is perverted in the figure of the Muslimina, whose physical deaths no longer belong to them as an ending to a distinctly human time, a human existence. The Holocaust for Adorno thus marks the true end of the theological concept of the soul, even in its secularized form, as the bourgeois individual able to assert some agency over the narrative construction of a life and a life story. Radical immanence, total materiality, the place of skulls, is the radical reduction to the utterly material. The individual is dismantled both as a physical object, but also as a metaphysical claim. Part of Adorno's point here, of course, is that the business of metaphysics can't possibly go on as usual after Auschwitz. To do so would be not just a moral, but indeed an epistemic obscenity. As Jay Bernstein once put it, our conscience repugnance at metaphysical transcendence simultaneously makes the question of metaphysics a question of conscience in general. But the turn to transience, of radical immanence and radical materiality as the bases for metaphysical experience, has more to it than a matter of conscience. It is also a claim about the objective conditions for knowledge under transformed conditions. And this, I would parenthetically add that the thesis of the normative deficits of modernity is, I think, for Adorno, not nearly not complete. It is also a question of the epistemic deficits of modernity and crises of experience. And here Adorno makes his second addition to the idea of post-Auschwitz metaphysical experience, and that is survivor guilt, which for Adorno is not just a psychological feature of the one still alive. In his version, survivor guilt is itself a new mode of metaphysical experience, if you will, the experience of abjection, of the dismantling of both the psychic and the epistemic foundations on which an independent ego can rest. The guilty survivor experience is not just the awful question of his or her entitlement to existing, but the metaphysical question about the very mode of existence itself. Whether in this case he, Adorno himself, may be nothing more than a transient flickering image in one of the final nightmares of someone who died in the camps 20 years earlier. This is the final negation of the Kantian claim that the concept of the soul as a pure practical postulate of reason could provide a last secular permit for using metaphysics to counter the certainty of physical death as total obliteration. What could this kind of metaphysical experience have in common with the Proustian one that I described earlier? The categories of radical transience and radical immanence are, of course, more than the negation of the traditional concerns of metaphysics. They are two faces of a negative secular theology. Whether in the form of fading memory traces of utopian moments of life lived without fear, or of ego shattering and time distorting particles of historical suffering, transience as the basis of metaphysical experience is both disruptive and disclosive. It disrupts the lie that the bourgeois ideal of the fully self-narratable life story has become under conditions of total integration. And it discloses in both its utopian and its hellish modalities the rifts and discontinuities, the Risse und Schrunde, that belie that ideal and negatively gesture toward what is missing. Both are elements of what Adorno, in a passage that Peter interprets, the famous passage at the end of Minimum Moralia, calls those perspectives that displace and estrange the world, reveal it to be, with its rifts and crevices, as indigent and distorted as it will appear one day in the messianic light. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Hent, your turn.
Thank you, Stefanos, Camille, Charlie, and Jonas for hosting this event and for the kind invitation to contribute. And thank you, Peter, for giving us once again a lot to think about in matters of shared interest. I fondly remember the similar occasion that Steph mentioned not so long ago, when we debated your book, Adorno and Existence, and the volume whose publication we're celebrating today has likewise forced me to revisit and rethink positions that I, for one, had uncritically assumed, but also to consider possible interpretations unjustly ignored, just as it has once again taught me things that were completely unexpected and new. The book under consideration adds, in my view, several layers to what was already a deeply subtle and complex argument in the earlier work. Now, if I may, I would like to bring up in all brevity a few striking points that, if I'm not mistaken, go to the heart of the matter that you raise in Migrants in the Profane. And not incidentally, they address its title as well. In some and somewhat counterintuitively, hopefully not too provocatively, I want to suggest that there is a possible reading of the authors you discuss. And in terms of your own account of them, that might stipulate that we may not always and everywhere need to migrate in the precise philosophical rather than historical, political, and biographical sense that you give to this term. And further also, and here I'm risking a bit too much perhaps, that the profane ultimately in all of this is not what matters. I may have a few other topics to discuss in a later round, but I will just limit myself to these few. So first, to what extent and in what precise sense does secularization serve as an organizing theme, as you put it on page 2, in the work of Benjamin, Horkheimer, and Adorno. Adorno's position in this matter, the most systematic and consistent of the three, as you point out, is characterized by you as deeply ambivalent. Everything hinges, of course, on how this characterization is meant and understood. Migrants in the Profane does an excellent job in laying out the various nuanced ways and sometimes abrupt changes in which this ambivalence is perceived and expressed. Let me quote, "Does secularization mean the disappearance of religion or its transformation? In the modern era, can religious concepts retain both their relevance and their validity in a secular age? Or is the dissolution of religion a philosophical and political necessity if we are to think of ourselves as truly modern?" That's also page 2. I've long been tempted to say that there is perhaps not just a minimum remainder of theological engagement to be found in these authors' writings. With Adorno, again, I would agree with you there, being the most exemplary, interesting, and relentless among them. But that secularization, or here the migration into the profane, is here and there of relevance and the only option. And then again, not at all. Clearly, theologoumena are cited, mentioned, and used, at times abused, without ever being fully stripped bare or emptied out. Whether we think of secularization or projected migration as extended through time, or as you suggest, as a movement through space, page 110, it goes perhaps too far to suggest that migration into the profane is a unilinear or unidirectional, in one word, irreversible process. We should resist, here my temptation comes in play, we should perhaps resist the overall skeptical conclusion that even though Adorno is close to negative theology, and the comparison with Maimonides, read here with the help of Moshe Halbertal and Avishai Margalit, in their studies of this author and their critique of idolatry, forms one of the most suggestive parts of the book. Even though Adorno is close to negative theology, he refuses consideration, any consideration of the transmundane, presumably, you say, due to the stubborn fact that he, Adorno, has no genuine interest in the affirmation of religious consciousness, even as it may be refined through philosophy, page 135. And yet to say as much is to take inverse theology, Adorno's enigmatic and privileged concept, I would say. To say as much is to take his inverse theology as merely serving, quote, quasi-theological purposes that have little to do with his actual aims, as you put it on page 136. You suggest compellingly that Adorno pursues the Maimonidean project even further than Maimonides himself. And you go on to say that the evacuation of positive terms in negative theology achieves its full meaning only when it touches on the concept of God and evacuates even that concept of its reality, page 139. But if this is the case, then everything hinges on defining, if one could say so, the irreality or inexistence of God, including of the possible redemption that the name of God indelibly stands for. What might its critical energy, if not substantive remedy, still or yet again mean and entail here for Adorno? This much is clear. There would be no need to honor religion, or what remains of it, if one sustained, and I'm quoting here, a principal commitment to the dialectical redemption of secular society from within, page 142. But indeed, no redemption, it would seem, comes from within alone. But there is more. The flip side, I would say, of assuming God, not just with Maimonides, but with Immanuel Kant and Hermann Cohen, as a merely transcendental idea, is also that such an idea is by definition, if strangely, that is paradoxically, apparatically, and hence perhaps unintelligibly, always available. And dare one say, possibly active and operative, or if one likes nowadays, inoperative, at all times and anywhere. And this unconditionally and without limitation, that is, absolutely. As such, it says, intimates, you might say, nothing, but also all. And it seems to me that there are, several motifs and maxims in Adorno's writing, including the negative dialectics, that give this away. Adorno's remarkable claim that all philosophy revolves around the ontological proof for the existence of God, right? His no less striking assertion that redemption should include the resurrection of the body, right? And his complaint that the historical Abrahamic religions have not taken the last things, that is eschatology and perhaps its accompanying apocalypse, as seriously as they should have. Now, when Adorno speaks of a minimal or negative metaphysics that has, quote, taken flight into the profane, he is, one might say, not dramatizing, much less applauding the refugee character of its modern regimen. Adorno's register, I would say, on this admittedly somewhat counterintuitive reading is not that of melancholy or loss. There's ample proof of musings, Max brought them up already, about home. The lure of evocative place names is a case in point, and child memories are another. But more importantly, it could well be defended that Adorno wants to lead the messianico-metaphysical impulse, if not back home, then onto a word and place or praxis that might prepare or offer a home for them at last. And of course, Flaschenpost, the message in the bottle, thrown in a desolate ocean, might be one such figure. But others, it would seem to me, are welcomed and hoped for, if not affirmed, or so much as even expected. Everything, again, on this reading could just as well be completely different for a thought that considers all historical determination and the very concept of continuous, homogeneous being and the order of things it entails as metaphysically contingent. The motif of promises, losses, and the, for all we know, left melancholia that comes with it is thus also counterbalanced with another, which is the motif of the telegoumenon, of the so-called, in Greek, apokatastasis ton panton, the restitutio omnium, or the restitutio in antiquum, that, as Michael Jennings has argued, goes back to Paul and especially to Origen of Alexandria, and that Benjamin found so fascinating in his reading of Adolf von Harnack's trilogy, the Lehrbuch der Dogmengeschichte, which we are being told he read twice. So there is a strange streak of anachronism, and I would say a resolute anti-historicism that ultimately, on my reading, the counterintuitive reading, informs Adorno's work in these writings. And as Peter himself insists throughout, the commandment to wander, the peregrina in seculo, that is, quote, to uproot ourselves from the certitude of sacred truth and accept the challenge of a life that has no foundations other than the ones we fashion, as he puts it on page 147, that commandment is both, quote, ancient and modern, end of quote, as references to and invocations of the Hebrew Bible and Augustine next to Maimonides amply illustrate. So the philosophical rather than biographical or intellectual historical question and meaning of religious inheritance in the Frankfurt School then is, on this view, not only or not primarily one of its gradual loss or disappearance, but also, one might say, one of its surprising reaffirmation, and I would say even its hyperbole. What these guys are doing is doubling down, I might say. When a, quote, concept that originally belonged to religion undergoes a shift of terrain and migrates into the profane, as you put it on page 8, one might, on this reading, say that it does not only become weaker, smaller, and uglier, right? Think of Benjamin, but paradoxically also stronger, greater, potentially glorious and triumphant. At any rate, it seems that for Adorno at least, it settles for nothing less. And in this critical theory's challenge to Western thought and its old new modernity is also one of arrogation, in the precise sense that Stanley Cavell inherits from the moral perfectionists and transcendentalists. Unlike melancholia, such an attitude, one might say, in fact, coheres easily with the Frankfurt School's Marxist or neo-Marxist commitments. Now, more could be said, but I'll stop here. And needless to say, these are not by any measure criticisms leveled at this wonderful book. I think they reflect a real ambiguity and ambivalence indeed in at least Adorno's late text and in the very meticulous reading that Peter offers of them. What I want to suggest, though, is that there may be no way out of the predicament of all predication as we know it thus far, that these latter texts entail, intellectually and morally, but also spiritually and politically. This may well be our plight, modern or not, and come to think of it, also our only chance, as an at once minimal and maximal opening and perspective on hope, on things and history being what they are, which is immanence and repetition of the ever same. And I'll stop here for the moment.
Oh, thank you, Hent. Peter, you bit off a lot when when we set this up. Not more than you can chew, but I don't know how to. I don't really want to keep you to time, so I think let's say that in 15 minutes or so, I'm just going to start quietly waving toward you to pause, so we can move into a bit more discussion. This is a good time for anybody who'd like to start preparing us for questions you might want to ask to start signaling. But Peter.
Yeah, well, thank you to all three of you. Your comments are lovely and challenging and point in many different directions at once, which is bracing, of course. And I can't respond to everything that's been raised. I can hardly do justice to even one set of remarks. Let me. I'll just offer just a few brief responses, and I'll go in reverse order because we just heard Hent, and so Hent, your wonderful searching remarks are foremost in my mind. It could be that that what we're doing is lending less or more emphasis to certain gestures that we find in Adorno, and you and I have spoken about this before. The characteristic of Adorno is to produce texts that aren't wholly univocal, and one of the consequences of that, of course, is to give rise to this possible disagreement in the way we read him, when even on a sentence by sentence level, he creates statements that perform a negative dialectic, affirming on a principle until it seems to negate itself, permits us, of course, to unlock statements like that in two different directions, where on the one hand, we might insist on the affirmation of theology. On the other hand, we might insist on the negation of theology. So where you might want to say what these guys are doing is doubling down, in your words, I will want to insist on the contrary, that they are resisting and pulling away. And I think we're both right. I mean, there's just simply too much there to unpack. The reason why I read Adorno the way I do has something to do perhaps with the phrasing with which you concluded, where you said that even as theology gets secularized or moved into the profane, it becomes stronger and potentially triumphant. And I would want to say that right there in that sort of phrasing, we can see what, for me, what for Adorno would be a rather troubling affirmation of religious categories. The migration into the profane is, in other places, called by Adorno metaphysics migrating into micrology. And the result is an emphasis on the precarious, the evanescent, all of the themes that Max discussed before, anything but religion triumphant. If religion emerges or can survive this difficult process of migration, it survives only in fragments and only in the negative, in what I would call the critical gesture of negation. It doesn't survive in dogmatic form. Even the resurrection of the dead and the resurrection of the body, which Adorno finds so intriguing, doesn't seem to me to suggest any kind of affirmation of eternal life. On the contrary, I would suggest that what Adorno means to affirm is the necessity of our embodiment. And what he says in the conclusion of Negative Dialectics is that it's the mystical traditions, both Judaism and Christianity, that have always placed infinite value on the place of immanence as the only place that can be of true religious value. So this is, so again, even the concept of resurrection is not meant to double down on, say, traditional notions of eternity, but on the contrary, on the fact of our embodiment, with all of the evanescence and fragility that embodiment implies. There's much more I could say, and Hent, thank you for your lovely comments. And this is, of course, I think part of an ongoing discussion that you and I have, and you and I will continue it on many other occasions, I hope. Max, I'm going to continue to move in reverse order here. Max, I loved your comments, and as you know, you and I have discussed this on many occasions. One of those occasions being when I first presented the paper on Adorno's concept of metaphysical experience at, of course, the institute. The institute at Cornell that Hent runs. You made a very interesting remark at the end that part of the problem of modernity is not just a normative deficit, but an epistemic deficit, which is to say that we no longer can correctly grasp the nature of our own condition, in part because of the totalizing effects of modern ideology or the culture industry, an affirmative society that hides from us the very deficits that afflict us in our condition. And this is, I think, such an important point, and one that I really didn't speak to in the book at all. Adorno's notion of the normative deficit of modernity is in certain respects rather different from the ones we find in Benjamin and Horkheimer, because it's much more about the way in which ideology or the culture industry has become so total that we have ceased to realize that there is anything missing. And one One reason that's the case for Adorno is that we've lost the capacity for experience. The withering of experience is, of course, something that he discusses elsewhere. And it's that withering of experience that makes those glimpses of metaphysical experience, those Proustian moments of qualified redemption, so important for him. The only thing I want to suggest, not to challenge you in any sense, but maybe to join your comments with Hent's, is that we need to recognize that even those metaphysical experiences are shot through with the damage of the modern world. And Adorno is very clear about that. And as you know, in the conclusion of Negative Dialectics, where he mentions metaphysical experiences of that sort, he says that they also are shot through with disappointment. For example, if a place like that is so pregnant with redemptive promise, the difficulty is, the painful fact is, the melancholy fact is that if you go to that place, you will be disappointed. So the damage of modern life afflicts even those small glimpses of redemption that that place names are supposed to promise. And again, this really isn't a corrective, but just to lend even further emphasis to what you said. Finally, turning to Seyla's remarks, which are wonderful and point in so many directions, and of course asked me to speak about thinkers who weren't in the book. Let me just say the very painful fact of ever reading one's book once it's published is that the luminous screen is suddenly replaced by the fragile and imperfect page. And the first thing that happened to me when I opened up the book was to see that compromise had become comprise. What deconstructive and inventive readings we might give of that typographical error, I don't know. I'm hoping there's a redemptive reading of it, and I'd like to imagine that there is. But enough said. In the paperback version, God willing, there's a paperback version, it will be corrected, and it will become compromise. Now, as to why Marcuse isn't there, Marcuse really isn't there because I guess the most banal reason is the format of the original lectures at Yale was for 3 lectures, and only 3. So 3 thinkers was all I could handle. The truth also, however, is that I don't feel I have ever sufficiently digested Marcuse's work as to make him really an interlocutor. And that's my own failing. It's something I'm trying to remedy actually right now. But I'd like to hear from others who are on this Zoom session how Marcuse might fit into the story. Seyla, you mentioned Max Horkheimer and his changing assessments of anti-Semitism, and you touched upon his changing evaluation of religion and its importance, which is, of course, the topic of the 2nd chapter in the book. And for those of you who have read the book, you'll know that I trace out his changing evaluation of religion. In the earliest phase of his writing, he had a much more robust materialist orientation, which disparaged religious categories and disparaged metaphysics as really irrelevant to the Marxist practice of changing the world from within. In the late work, which I concentrate on, there's this reevaluation, this strong turning toward religion and the promise that is afforded by the concept of the holy other. And it's, of course, at that moment that right at the end of his life that Horkheimer offered the loving tribute to Marty J's Dialectical Imagination, in which he remarks on the concept of the holy other. And I discuss the curious modification that appears in that foreword, where Horkheimer changed the phrase, "It is of course a metaphysical wish," to "it is a non-scientific wish," and I try to place some emphasis on that. But what really intrigued me is the middle phase, which I don't think has received enough credit. And here I was trying in a very, very gentle way to alert Habermas to something that I don't think he takes into consideration in his own early essay on Horkheimer, which is that I think that Horkheimer and Adorno in Dialectic of Enlightenment offer what you might call an assessment of the dialectic of monotheism. And it happens very briefly, just on one page. But it's, I think, a crucial moment where Horkheimer with Adorno recognize that monotheism is not just a figure of our emancipation from mythic immanence, which is to say it doesn't bear just the promise of the emergence of a critical perspective. And therefore, we can't align them only with Karl Jaspers and the promise of an axial turn. On the contrary, at the same time, they admit a dialectic in the emergence of monotheism itself, because monotheism is the, as you might say, the paradigm of the emergence of world transcendent subjectivity. It's the paradigm for the emergence of a subject who dominates the world. And that dialectic of monotheism is something that I think Habermas misses when he joins hands with Karl Jaspers and celebrates the axial revolution. What Adorno and Horkheimer understood in that middle phase of Horkheimer's career is that monotheism is Janus-faced. It points in two directions. Yes, it is a figure of our emancipation from mythic immanence and irrationality, but at the same time, it is the Ura paradigm, we could say, for the emergence of the subject who is bent on the domination of nature. I could go on and develop. I have many more responses to you, Seyla, about the thesis of the normative deficit. You say you're irritated by that idea that modernity suffers from a normative deficit. I will confess that I'm irritated as well, and it's an irritation that goes all the way back to my reading of Charles Taylor's wonderful book, and it's the irritation that produced the book I wrote. So thank you to all three of you.
Martin J. raised his hand.
Not quickly into, I have this peculiar problem of having to go to my dentist in a few minutes. So let me just make one quick point. I'm not sure if some of you saw the wonderful PBS show last night on the Black Church that Skip Gates put together. But it raises the important question of the relationship between theology and religion as experience and as practice. The Frankfurt School was, except for for Lowenthal and Fromm, unschooled in religious experience. And they, in a way, were trafficking as what we might call religious fellow travelers in ideas about religion, in theology, in notions of metaphysics that were essentially non-experiential and so forth. And so what is missing in a way is the actual link between theory and practice, the link between a theory that is essentially one that is very distant from any contemporary religious experience or religious experience as such. And one of the things that comes out of the experience of the Black Church that one, in a way only understands obliquely, if you're not a participant, is the extent to which it is an experience that does have a profane implication in the civil rights movement, one that, contrary to Seyla's, I think, astute observation that often religion leads to conservative and even worse political implications, had a much more powerful emancipatory one in this world that is a world of continuity between religious experience and the profane. So I would say the Frankfurt School's trafficking in theological ideas, metaphysical ideas, is one that lacks that kind of immediacy. And one has to be, I think, aware of the fact that religion doesn't die in the modern world, that it has experiential force. And although I don't have time to it, I think it would be useful to develop a discussion of the storming of the Capitol in terms of a kind of resurrection of a notion of the sacred that goes all the way back to Durkheim's idea of elementary forms of religion as a kind of primitive effervescence, and it's connected with the Collège de Sociology's discussion of a kind of religious violence, which is one that basically destroys traditional authorities, the let's call it establishment sacredness of the world that exists in the name of some other world that has ideal, utopian, messianic implications. Now, we obviously don't feel very comfortable with the outcome of that, but it shows how powerful that still exists as a potentiality in the modern world, one that often manifests itself in nationalist and other forms of violence. So these are aspects of what I would call the endurance of religion that is lost in the overly intellectual notion, religion as nothing but theology, religion is nothing but the search for normativity, as nothing but basically an intellectual, religious fellow traveling game. So on that note, I have to go to my dentist and let everybody on. I'd love to stick around. This is an absolutely fabulous discussion. Well, let me just simply, but other things, thank Peter for his wonderful dedication and thank him for continuing the tradition of critical theory among intellectual historians as well as among philosophers, sociologists, and of course theologians. Thanks very much. Take care.
Seyla, Hent, or Max, would you want to jump into this? And then I have Joel Whitebook on the side. But I wanted to give you a chance if you wanted to. Otherwise, Joel, it's all yours.
What do I have to do here?
You're fine. Go ahead and talk.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on something that you said, Peter, concerning the resurrection of the body. I agree with you. I don't think it has anything to do with the transcendence of the body and materiality or the life after death. In fact, I think what it refers to is the idea from the dialectic of enlightenment that there's another history to Europe concerning the fate of the instincts. And in this case, the resurrection of the body would mean the resurrection of the body that had been sacrificed in the domination of nature. And as such, it not only represents an anti-theological motif, but I would suggest it also represents an anti-Christian motif.
Peter?
Oh, Steph, yeah, sorry, I'm just,
Presumably it wasn't for me, so yes.
Oh, okay. No, I don't understand the format exactly. Joel, this is an interesting thought. I tend to think that let's see, let me organize my thoughts here for a minute. I want to insist, despite the frame of the book, that there are themes in Adorno's work in particular that may, if they betray any affiliation with religion and religious identity or religious interests, might in fact point more toward Catholicism than Judaism, which has to do precisely with the themes of embodiment and with the fragile, even the tortured body of Christ. We know very little about Adorno's earliest childhood feelings about his mother's Catholicism, but whether it's from Catholicism or not, I would want to say that this theme of the resurrection of the body is not unknown to Christianity in particular, of course, and the resurrection of the body is something different from the let's say the liberation of the instincts. It seems to me that there's something of a difference there. At the same time, I agree with you, of course, in Dialectical Enlightenment and elsewhere, it's very clear that that recalling or restoring for us our mimetic relationship to nature functions as a kind of normative anchor for Adorno. It's the thing that needs to be held on to, revived all the more, because so much of the civilizing process involves persecuting the instincts and destroying or even breaking the mimetic bond. Just one quick thing on Marty's comments, although Marty himself has left. The question of religious practice is a very, very interesting one that, of course, Habermas in Post-Metaphysical Thinking 2 addresses in a very interesting chapter, which I think we might say is in the mode of a speculative anthropology. It's precisely addressed to the question of religious practices and the normativity that the sense of communal solidarity and moral insight that Habermas believes is generated out of religious practices. And I just want to say that as someone who went through a phase of fairly faithful religious observance, I've come out the other end, but during that phase, I participated in some of the rituals that Habermas seems to be describing there, and I actually wrote him about this in a rather skeptical mode, saying that it's entirely possible, of course, to participate in religious communities and to engage in embodied practices of religion, and to not have those practices generate anything like the kind of world transcendent experience of the sacred, or to have it generate anything like the metaphysical insights that Habermas gently suggests might be generated out of religious practices. So I wrote him about this. I said, look, it's a nice thought that religious communities somehow are preserves of what he calls at the end of Auch eine Geschichte der Philosophie, he calls them in der Welt einbrechende, what's the phrase? In the world, experiences of a power breaking into the world from outside of it. And he thinks that religious communities are somehow preserves of that experience. And I'm not so certain. I mean, I think sometimes they describe themselves as such. But here I would invoke what Seyla said about Durkheim. I think it's also entirely possible to read religious practices as practices that that preserve and sustain and periodically reconfirm for us our own social bond. And they don't therefore bear any distinctive metaphysical or extra mundane marks. They can be experiences of the immanent solidarity of the social.
I have my hand up, but I can't figure out how to do it. Am I cutting in front of anyone?
Go ahead.
No. I do want to try to connect with Peter's last comments and what Marty said, and maybe what I mean. Here, I think the question about religion and why I'm bringing in this matter of irritation is, you know, we on the left have been at times very contemptuous of political liberalism. I am a political liberal, but not an economic neoliberal by any means. I'm a progressive social democrat. And Daniel Bell used to say he's a cultural conservative, political liberal, and economic social. I don't share that about culture with him either. But what I'm trying to get at is this. Religion, to survive in a liberal society, has to accept its epistemological limitedness, its epistemological relativism in a way, right? And, you know, the minute it tries to be totalizing, the minute Modi in India presents Hinduism as the essence of the Indian religion, negating 140 million Muslims. India is the largest Muslim country in the world, right? Religion flows over and becomes dangerous, and dogmatism and everything. Now, we have to have a serious discussion about this. Why is this happening? I mean, Walzer used to talk about liberalism and the art of separation. The art of separation is very difficult. And today, you know, we're living in a world where people are so downtrodden and aggravated and anxious and insecure, dispossessed about everything, that they are not about to respect anything about the art of separation. But, you know, we have to be sanguine about that. We can't just say to religion, okay, give us a sense of motivation and identity, but don't mess up with our politics. As Peter says, Benjamin, who struggled with political theology, came closest to this conundrum, and, you know, then brought in, you know, Carl Schmitt. But I have always asked myself about Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. How do we coexist with political liberalism, not economic liberalism, but political liberalism in the sense that we respect the right of each other and different communities to have a sense of the good that is different than ours, and that we still cooperate, to have a sense of the transcendent good that we don't share, but that we can respect. This is unbelievably difficult. And I don't feel as if, you know, we should forget this and sort of go back. I mean, when Marty brought up the example of the Black churches, when I was writing my comments, I said to myself, Black churches, liberation theology. And, you know, these are the two examples that are going to come up in terms of emancipatory powers of religion. There are many others. I mean, in the Muslim world, you know, there is the power of Shiism against Sunnism, which has now become orthodoxy, and so on. But we have to keep our eye on the ball in asking not about the motivational force of religion, but religion in the liberal, you know, multicultural polity. And I heard Marty also saying something about effervescence of the crowds marching onto the Capitol on January 6th. I think we all felt that. And we all felt, I think, not we, I'm not going to, I felt both scared and impressed. I was taken aback that they did this. You know, there was just like, anyways, what he was referring to here is also a certain power of religion among some of these groups, you know, to motivate it. So it's, and just one last remark, forgive me if, you know, I don't mean to be rambling. What I wanted to say about Marcuse, and I think maybe Joe, I think that Marcuse had the classical Greek idea of emancipation as reconciliation with the body. His image is that of, I mean, remember, Arab civilization is about Narcissus. And it's not the Jewish tradition. And even, when Marcuse at the end, came close to the women's movement, the Black liberation movement, in a way that, none of them could. I mean, they would pull their hair out and run away, whatever remained of their. And Marcuse was, this is another dimension, that the classicist dimension. Maybe it's the influence of Heidegger, the continuing influence of Heidegger in critical theory.
Jonas, do you want to go ahead? Or?
Yes, we have two more questions, at least. First Gordon, and then Eric.
Right, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Okay, I've got a question about your title, Peter, which is Migrants in the Profane. And reading that, I thought, first, must apply to the figures you talk about, Benjamin, Horkheimer, and Adorno. And I thought at least you might have meant that with it. And migrants, when you think about it, is that when we use the word migrants, we normally mean immigrants rather than emigres, right? We don't call them emigrants for some reason. I think there's a significance to that. It might be accidental. An emigre is somebody who's achieved, as it were, something and been assimilated, like Isaiah Berlin in Oxford. But an immigrant somehow never leaves their origins behind, right? In a way that certainly Adorno didn't when he got to America. He lived in this community of expatriate Germans. And then I was thinking, well, Horkheimer and, I mean, I don't know what you think about this, but Horkheimer and Benjamin, it seemed to me, they were kind of immigrants in the profane, in the sense that they came from an Orthodox religious background and sort of sojourned in a Hegelian Marxist kind of sort of arena. And in Horkheimer's case, went back. Of course, Benjamin never got the opportunity. But it seems to me that, and you kind of figure this in your book quite well, that Adorno's rather different, right? He began and he ended, I think, a kind of secular humanist and an atheist. And so the puzzle, in a way, with Adorno, right? He's not an immigrant in the profane. He's just a profane thinker. And the puzzle with Adorno is, well, where did those ideas and that content that he uses in his philosophy that has those indelibly religious connotations, where did that come from? And it seems to me, I mean, that seems to me, the real question. And in fact, it's the question that he asked a lot. And those phrases that you take, die Einwanderung ins Profane and the Einzug von der Mystik in der Profanität, they're all about ideas. And that second one, I'm pretty sure it's a reference to Benjamin. I'm pretty sure he thinks Benjamin takes ideas from Jewish mysticism, right, and somehow uses them to interpret, his kind of profane secular thoughts. Now, so I just, that was really it, really. The reference of that. Are you talking about these people? Are you differentiating between them, or are they all migrants in the profane, or are you really referring to the these ideas that make their way into the kind of Hegelian Marxist idiom of these thinkers?
Thank you, Gordon. What a lovely question. I won't do justice to it, but I want to do justice to other people who should have room to ask their questions. So very, very quickly, I mean, the title is meant to be suggestive, of course, applying to the three thinkers in question, but also to the notion of the concepts that must migrate. And then, of course, in the larger expansive sense, I'm trying to suggest that all of us are in some sense migrants, building upon Augustine images in the Bible and so forth. But I think you're entirely right that that Adorno stands at the greatest remove from the religious traditions whose concepts he nonetheless finds intriguing. Benjamin wasn't Orthodox, of course. I mean, Benjamin's childhood religious practice was much more attenuated than Horkheimer's. At least that's what I understand. But this does give me an occasion to make one point, and I'm grateful to you for bringing it up because it's something I didn't include in the book and I regretted it. There is a difference between Auswanderung and Einwanderung, between those who migrate elsewhere, who wander out, Auswanderung, and Einwanderer, or those who are immigrants into a new territory. And the German is distinct that way. It marks that difference, those who leave and those who arrive. And it's interesting that Adorno uses the phrase Einwanderung, which implies, it seems to me, that he is himself an inhabitant of the profane as well, and that what he's looking at are the arrivals. But it also, much to my distress, suggests a sense of arrival. Einwanderung means entry into a place that has certain, let's say, defining characteristics and boundaries and so forth. And I say to my distress because it seems to confirm not only the theme of uprooting, but also the theme of rerouting, not only departure, but arrival. And, you know, as some of you might have noticed, there's a kind of, there's a rather subtle statement against Zionism that is encrypted into the conclusion of the book. So, and Judaism itself, of course, begins with the image of an ancestor uprooting himself to move to a promised land, which is to say it includes both the command to depart and the command to arrive. And I have to say I'm much more comfortable with the theme of departure than I am with the one of arrival. But thank you for your question.
Eric.
Just let me try to ask this briefly. Another question about really the title, but the kind of guiding concept here, which is that I think it's fair to say that the concept of secularization, you're trying to give it a kind of dialectical turn by relating it to moving in or out of the profane. Maybe you could speak a little bit to the fact that the concept is, of course, notoriously one way in its logic, but also relate it to, I think, one of the kind of topoi in the Frankfurt School in terms of thinking about the concept of secularization is that quotation of Krauss's Origin as Goal, right? Which is, of course, coming from Krauss, but then Benjamin cites it in the, I guess, the thesis, I think, right, of talking about the emptiness of time in particular. And Adorno then cites it again in Negative Dialectics relating to the question of Schelling, but also the problem of evanescence and meaning. And I guess my question here is, first of all, is it possible to make secularization a dialectical concept? But also, what about the concept of origin and goals? Are they themselves secularized or secular religious concepts at all themselves? Are they inherently secularized? Is that part of the ending of the process? Because I think in many ways that question cuts back to the Benjaminian notion of an insight here of origins as having a kind of normative aura about them, but also to the question of criticism. So could you maybe speak to that a little?
Eric, thank you so much. These are such suggestive questions, and there's so many things I'd like to say in response. My thoughts are rushing in upon me. The one thing I would say, just to begin a conversation with you about this, and I look forward to continuing it, is that it seems to me that if there's one category that tends to provoke an allergy in Adorno, it's the concept of origin. Mm-hmm. Which is because it's a concept he associates with the archaic, with the authentic, with an uncontaminated plenitude that precedes all the complexities of the dialectic, of critical turns, growth, development, even education, which, as we know from his work as a public intellectual in the Federal Republic, was very important for him. Origin never becomes a normative category for him, it seems to me. Even the notion of mimesis is something that he approaches in a gingerly fashion, with some concern lest mimesis become what he called in Dialectic of Enlightenment, mimesis of mimesis, which is to say the simulation of authenticity, i.e. fascism. So Origin, it seems to me, for Adorno, rarely becomes what it was for a figure like Heidegger, where Ursprung is, and the primordial is always a category of deep investment. You know, what's been destroyed and needs to be recalled and recovered. There's much more I could say, but I'll stop there.
Thank you.
And you want to go next?
Yes, if I may, just a comment in response to something Joel White brought up, and what Seyla brought into the discussion as well. It had, so for one thing, the motif of the resurrection of the body is a critique in that context of, let's say, an idealist ideal of, let's say, perennial existence, which Adorno counterpoints by suggesting that would be perverse. So there is a materialist motif there. But unless I'm mistaken, the motif also harkens back to, let's say, the conversation between Horkheimer and Benjamin about those who have been slain. And now I'm all with Seyla in the sense that we should not think lightly about the accomplishments and the critical potential of political liberalism. But what I take Adorno to pay homage to here, or to remind us of, is that an emphatic notion of truth and of justice, let alone redemption, would have to include, let's say, past generations. It would have to include something like, justice done to those who have been violently slain. And resurrection of the dead, would entail that. So a second motif that I just want to briefly mention, Peter spoke very beautifully about the Adorno's dialectical suspension. His philosophy takes up a position of dialectical suspension between the sacred and the profane. And there is mention made of the trial of rationalizing secularization, as if there were like a perennial, ongoing process of secularization. Now, if I understand these two motifs correctly, something like an ongoing trial, test, probe of secularization and this dialectical suspension, then that, on my reading, somehow tells me that philosophically speaking and theologically speaking, Adorno and maybe much of Frankfurt School critical theory can be neither relegated to either the side of theism or atheism. It's all about, the metaphysical experience, or as he also puts it, much more interestingly, even a form of spiritual experience, geistige Erfahrung. And the geistige Erfahrung does not ever affirm myth, magic, mana, or even spiritualization. It's somehow holding out, let's say, an open space that is not even identified with das Heilige as it would have been in Rudolf Otto, but with indeed an idea, the absolute, mindful of what Marty just said, fairly abstract philosophical ideas, theorems as much as they are theologoumena. But I think the point there is that the citation and use of these motifs is never to, let's say, espouse a conception of man as homo religiosus, nor to, let's say, pay lip service to the neo-Kantians and assume that we have some kind of religious a priori. It's a form of perspectivalism, you might say, citing strong motifs, but for the sake of an absolute that even those motifs, those theologoumena, would betray, right? That's why, God is only respected by those who do not believe in God, right? But again, that's not theism or atheism, but something like a dialectical suspension.
Yeah, if I could I completely agree with that. That formulation, hence, I think captures my understanding of Adorno quite well. He's too much of a dialectician, really, in the end, to accept the dualism of theism on the one hand and atheism on the other. This is why I found it so annoying to see Adorno characterized as a religious thinker, but similarly, he's surely not some kind of dogmatic secularist.
No.
He's the figure of dialectical suspension, I think, captures quite well the position he stands in. The one thing I would say, however, and maybe this is once again to emphasize my difference with you, is we do need to note how he modifies the phrase, or actually how the original phrase in his correspondence with Scholem affirms not just a migration into the profane, but a ruthless, rücksichtslos migration into the profane, a migration without regret, without the backward glance. And that is indeed the affirmation of a unidirectional process. It may be one that is always ongoing, one that never reaches an absolute terminus of full secularization, but it is unidirectional.
Could I take then the last question, because we're at 7 o'clock. I'm going to ask you a quick double, Peter. The first one is, how does this book, the first one's more about the book. It's how does it sit as a book alongside your longer standing project on German thought and secularization? It seems to me much more assertive in a way than the overview account that I'd heard you give of it once. And in the book, you sort of said like, well, it displaces it a little and we'll see what happens to it. But I'm genuinely curious whether there's much more of an assertion here for the rest of that project to stand. The second question might follow up from what Gordon said, but it follows a little bit more from what you said in response to Gordon before. And that is, it seemed to me that throughout the book, you were negotiating, or even, let's say, trying to find a way to manage the language of peregrination, of migration, of exile, of homelessness. The figure of the refugee really kind of dies out after the introduction, reappears for a moment in the conclusion, but it's much more limited. The figure of the exile, similarly, is almost surprisingly gone. The peregrination issue, I get it that peregrines in the profane doesn't quite work. That has the cool falcon dimension, but that's a different thing. But I'm a little bit curious as to how you end up with a discussion of migrants in the conclusion, only to have a momentary twist into the discussion of home and homelessness, and to return to that point on migration. So it's this web of very similar, but not at all the same concepts that sticks on my mind as the space in which I'd invite you to close us off by discussing the relation between these different possible formulations and the decisions you eventually made.
It's a very discerning remark, Steph, and I think you're entirely right. I mean, the theme of the migrant, which appears in the introduction, only really comes back in the conclusion. It appears very briefly there when I make reference to Montesquieu's Persian letters, which shares a kind of Orientalist motif with Benjamin's image of the chess-playing Turk, and I make a brief mention there that touches on it, but it really only comes back in the conclusion. In part, this is because the book is more suggestive than definitive. I mean, it's a very slender book. It's a very modest set of suggestions rather than full-fledged arguments. I mean, and the speculative remarks about our peregrinatio in seculum, our own status as migrants, the deracinated nature of modern identity, and so forth. All of these are merely speculative and meant to offer an occasion for further thoughts elsewhere. How it relates to the larger project, however, is something I can speak to just in one or two words, which is to say that there has been a great deal of scholarship in the last, say, 20 years or so, adopting a skeptical view of discourses of secularization and secularism. Much of that work has been done in a genealogical mode or an anthropological mode, showing quite vividly the very painful paradoxes, the new forms of exclusion and domination that result when secularism takes a political, a dogmatic form. What I want to say is that a secularism that becomes exclusionary is betraying its own concept. And what we have to hold on to is the norm of secularism that involves inclusion rather than exclusion, that maps onto politics and makes of politics a framework that permits multiple religious identities to coexist. And if we don't want to call that secularism, that seems to me fine. I have no particular attachment to the term. But I think that those who adopt a skeptical genealogy towards secularism need to respond to the burden of proof here and say, what political form is it that we imagine if we admit that in the modern world we have conditions of ethno-religious heterogeneity, and we can't presume uniform notions of the sacred to simply govern our political life. Again, we don't need to call that secularism, but the question is, what form of political life can we imagine that would permit heterogeneity to persist, or in Adorno's phrase, to permit difference without domination? And that's really the core argument that I'm prosecuting in the larger book, which will take me many, many years. The next time I appear on Zoom, I will, if God willing, I still have hair, it will be completely gray.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Hent and Seyla and Max for this. But you've given us, you said, an occasion for further thought. You've given us much for further thought. For those of you who have asked, or some people have asked, obviously this is being recorded. I am going to stop the recording now. I have not decided where to put it online and what exactly to do with it. So if somebody should ask for the recording, please ask them to contact me. And, you know, we'll see. I really don't know what to do with it. So Yes, but thank you, Peter, and thank you all. This has been wonderful.
Thank you, everybody, the three commentators and everybody who hung with us to the end. This was a real honor and a real joy to talk with all of you and to see so many friends that many of you I haven't seen for quite a while. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter.
Take care.